Welcome to the Art of Photography, everyone. I'm your host, Ted Forbes, and today we are going to talk about using minimalist techniques in your photographs. Now, I think most photographers and designers, illustrators, artists would agree that when you're creating a visual composition, the hardest part isn't so much what to put into it. Sometimes the hardest part is what you leave out of it. And that's why I want to look at some minimalist techniques. And so what we're looking at here today is boiling your composition down into just the most basic shapes and forms to create a stronger visual impact in telling a story. And so let's go over to the computer right now, and we're going to look at some photos and take it from there. Okay, so moving over, we're going to look at some photographs today, and for our little lesson on minimalism here, I want to talk about a photographer named Michael Kenna. And Michael Kenna is a British photographer. He does excellent work. He kind of specializes in these real minimalist landscapes. He's pretty old school in terms of his technique. He shoots film, shoots on a Hasselblad camera, and does some darkroom manipulation, which kind of plays into this, and we'll talk about it in a minute. But you'll see that in this first image here, this is just absolutely beautiful, that he's really boiled this composition down into three basic elements. You have the sky, you have water, and you have these sticks that are standing out of the water, and they reflect as so, which is part of how you know this is water. And he uses a traditional darkroom technique of burning and dodging. And basically, we'll go over this in a separate podcast sometime, but it means when you're making the print is allowing more light to hit areas or less light, so you can control and get this heavy contrast. So you can see that the sky is really burned in up at the top here. Creates a little more interest, and same at the bottom, and they create some symmetry as well. But it's easy to talk about minimalist composition because this is so boiled down to just a few elements. You don't see anything else in here. There's no boats, there's no skyline, there's no shore. It's really just as bare bones as you can get. And you'll notice that the horizon line divides this photo directly in half here, and which is a technique common to a lot of minimalist photographers. But he also has the sticks, kind of sitting, if you remember the rule of thirds episode, and you might want to go back and watch that if you haven't seen it. But this is not directly in the middle of the photograph, it's just off axis a little bit to create some interest to your eye. We'll move on, look at some others. This is another kind of similar image. It's just a chair sitting on a beach, but you can see really we've got a golden section down here where your thirds divide, and same with the horizon. This is 1/3 of the way down, then 2/3 of the way down, and 2/3 of the way over. You have this point of interest where you have the chair, and again you can see heavy burning and dodging, a lot of heavy dodging up here on the horizon line, and then the sky's almost black up here. Skies don't normally do that. That's a technique that's usually done in the darkroom, and it's absolutely beautiful in Cana's work. This is another interesting photo of this castle on this hill. And the reason I'm using this, obviously, again, very minimal, rule of thirds, everything is kind of, by the book here. But what's really interesting to me is how, this photo kind of relates to some trends you see in photography today, and mainly I want to talk about HDR photography. And for those of you who don't know, HDR is a high dynamic range, and digital cameras compared to film cameras have a lower dynamic range than film does. And so HDR is a way of taking multiple exposures and then being able to get more detail in the shadows down here and stuff like this. But the reason I mention that is because, especially in Kena's work, it wouldn't be the same photo, and you wouldn't have that minimalist quality. It's okay to let things go dark and go completely to blacks in here. There's probably grass on this hill, and you can't tell, but it doesn't matter, because what we're doing with this kind of minimalist technique is really boiling this composition down to just the most basic elements you can come up with to avoid any distraction. It's very minimal, it's very simple, and it has a really strong dramatic effect. Kena's use of light is very interesting too. Most of his images are pretty high contrast. You have darks and bright whites, and there's not a whole lot in between, with some exceptions we'll look at in a minute. But anyway, I think that's pretty interesting when you kind of consider. This is another one. Gosh, I mean, talk about high contrast. This is these smokestacks here. This is just about black and white as you can get. He tones his photographs too, so they're not pure black and white. You're going to see the kind of the sepia going on in there. This was probably taken at night. Cana does a lot of night photography, and it was probably done in probably some kind of fog-like condition, and the smoke was probably coming out of these stacks. But anyway, you kind of get this gritty grain coming off the film in there, and it really accents this shape, and you can tell those are smokestacks. Without that, probably a little harder to discern. This is the Golden Gate Bridge. Cana did a lot of work working in San Francisco, I believe in the 80s. And it's interesting to me because like you've seen a lot of famous photographers shoot the Golden Gate Bridge. And I love this angle because it's not the angle people normally pick. And it's head on. You don't see any of the depth in the bridge, but you know, we know what it is, and you see the mountains back in the back. And also again, note that it is off center. He has a wonderful use of symmetry in here, but he pretty much conforms to the rule of thirds most of the time. It does create interest to the photo. I think it's real easy for you know, beginner photographers to try to get their symmetry lined up perfectly down the middle of the photograph and really that's fine, but the real interest is when you kind of pull that off axis a little bit. Again, rule of thirds episode if you haven't seen it. Another one that's really interesting, and you get a sense too, and we talked about this in that rule of thirds episode, but the use of diagonal lines that kind of complete triangles. And so you have you know, this axis coming up from the bottom left hand side and also the top left hand side. And it's just some sticks in kind of a mud swamp kind of area, maybe a field after a rain. But again, just simple, minimal techniques, you know, with wonderful detail without having to do HDR or anything like that. Moving along, this is also interesting too, and in some of Cana's work he explores, again, it's very minimal, you know, these heavy industrial photos, but what's interesting is the use of light in here. And we've kind of talked about the zone system that Ansel Adams employed a little bit, but basically you have shades of gray that you're playing with, and the darkest being this piece of machinery up in the front, the lightest being, you know, the backdrop of the smog or the clouds or the fog or whatever that is, and then you have various shades. The depth is created here not by depth of field. Everything's in focus, it's a very tight aperture, but the depth is created simply by the various shades of these mechanical objects that kind of come in and out, and the smokestacks almost blending in with the background. Very, very cool, very interesting. Again, this bridge, you don't see a lot of detail. I think this is, you know, this would be, you know, with the trends of the day would be to do something like this in HDR where you really get everything. And Cana didn't go for that. And I think there's a real beauty and simplicity and minimalist quality that you get from that. You obviously know that this is a bridge, and if this was an HDR, it would reveal so many details you would really lose a lot of that minimalist quality. But again, triangular shapes, diagonal lines, rule of thirds, things like that. And then finally, last image, and I simply love Cana's night work. This was done at night, and we'll do an episode of a tutorial on the podcast about how to shoot at night. But what's really cool, and I love this technique, but if you can, it's hard to line up because your weather is important, but if you get a partly cloudy night where the wind is blowing and the clouds are moving, you can basically do a really tight aperture, and this is a really long exposure. Okay, so the streaks in the sky were created by these clouds actually moving. So this may have been, you know, a 10-20 minute exposure, maybe even longer, you know, and that creates the interest. And of course you have the light down here, but these are really wonderful shots, and that night photography technique is simply beautiful. It would be very minimal without any activity in the sky, but not only do you have these beautiful clouds, but you have this wonderful dramatic sense of motion that just adds to the photo, but does not detract from, again, that minimalist quality. Anyway, but this is Cana's work. I'm going to put a link to his website in the show notes. He's got several books out. I recommend that, you know, if you're serious about this at all, you really study his work. And you know, like I said, the books are fabulous. You can find them on Amazon, all over the place. I'll put some links in the show notes on the website. So that's on thepublicbroadcast.com. So anyway, that's been you know, a quick look at minimalist photography, and thanks for watching.